University of Aberdeen. And I can warmly recommend his book, The Scots Imagination and Modern Memory, published by Edinburgh University Press and Columbia University Press in New York. It's an excellent book. I've used it many times in my own research and cited it in my own papers. But Andrew is going to talk to us today about Scotland's absent imagery, a journey to the interior. May I just ask, remind everybody that we are in fact recording this seminar, and that if anyone would prefer not to appear in the recording, they should turn off their microphone and the camera. May I remind everyone to stay muted throughout the seminar. And at the end of the talk, we hope to have time for a few questions when people then can unmute to ask Professor Blaikie their question. And welcome, Andrew. We're really, really, really looking forward to this talk.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Okay, because I had a sign on my screen saying I've been muted by others, but I appear to be happening. Okay, well, welcome everybody, and it's a delight to be able to talk to you, particularly in this way, which is new to me. I hope there aren't too many technical hiccups. My talk's going to be rather formal, and that's because I want to convey quite a bit of information. So forgive me if at times it appears like you're listening to the radio or a lecture and you want to go to sleep, or you go to sleep if you wish, but I'll try and keep you live. I have some visual material which I'm going to upload now. And just give me a second to do this. Okay, so Scotland's absent imagery, a journey to the interior. Really what I'm going to talk about today is the internal edge, the periphery, if you like, in that a lot of what we talk about when we talk about Scotland's imagery, or a lot of what we see historically, tends to be Scotland as peripheral. The Celtic periphery, or the peripheral conditions of people who are extremely poor, people who are particular, in the 19th century, people considered as types, Celtic types, and so on. And my basic conceit is that the encounter with modernity is framed as dualistic ways of seeing, which render particular kinds of places visible and iconic, while others are made invisible and opaque. And here I'll explore how it is that, paradoxically, in Scotland, the places where most people live, and which therefore would appear the most representative and worthy of analysis, are the very places about visually we know the least. In its focus on the sublime, romanticism was a moral and aesthetic reaction against the Industrial Revolution. So we have the country versus the city. In Scottish painting of the 18th and 19th century, so-called wild nature was privileged, with the Highlands coming to stand for all of Scotland. So we have Highlandism, as Horatio McCullough's painting of Glencoe in the Meeting of the Three Waters, for example. Meanwhile, the Wizard of Abbotsford, Scott, created a complex and fractured traveller's history of the nation. And such Highlandism was duly reflected in early landscape photography. The Grand Tour, if you like, acted as a precursor to the postcard, the travelogue, and the tourist guidebook in identifying what became iconic sites and typical views. And as the jury commented, if photographs were the only source available for reconstructing late Victorian Scotland. It would be like scenery and architecture, quote, with an economy that was largely pastoral and devoted to leisure. There would be apparently almost no heavy industry, and the main support of the agriculture would have been fishing and the provision of leisure services. So the imagery, as you can see on the slide, has to be somewhat limited in relation to Scottish society at the time. By the 20th century, visual representations of Scotland, I suppose in inverted commas now, had come overwhelmingly to consist of images of largely empty places, distant from the everyday working nation. We think of the numbers, for example, of women who left the countryside to become secretaries, clerks in the burgeoning factories. Hardly any images of those people. Yet Highlandism did find an echo in the depiction of the ills of urbanism. As Spring comments, the Glasgow of representation was Manichaean. Shadows, midnight scenes, and social photographs illustrated there. That's the cover of his pamphlet of 1858, consisting, like Mayhew's London vignettes, of written snapshots of the depraved East End, the dark side that was in dire need of moral redemption. And although Shadow talks about social photographs, and there is an etching here, his photographs, like Mayhew, were written text, short sort of cameos of the experience of, in this case, the East End of Glasgow. The pictorial image of the city became one dominated by housing, poverty, childhood, and slums, and a lineage initiated by Thomas Annan in the 1860s, and stretching forward over a century by the picture posts, Joe Nerdley, Oscar Mazzaroli, Joe Mackenzie, David Peaton. So we've got a familiar imagery of essentially the Glasgow slum. Phases in the photographic account parallel successive waves of demolition, rebuilding, a recurrent backdrop to successive generations of kids in tenements. It's ubiquitous urchins. And you have philanthropic organizations photographing ragged children, street Arabs as they were called, before and after rescue. Transformation from savage to civilized, for example. In the images of, these are Bernardo's images of children who were taken from the streets, rescued, as it were, and made anew. See the change in the clothing from the barefoot to the booted, for example, there. That's yet another dichotomy, equally reflected by ethnologists whose images of primitive and island types, as they call them, in the Hebrides, by definition, set the Celtic periphery against the metropolitan core. So, for example, Illustrated London News there at the top left of your screen, the evacuation of St Kilda, island types of 1930, island types and scenes of departure. These are seen as types, in a sense, different people from the rest of us. And an awful lot of imagery, particularly from the Highlands and Islands of this nature, exists in the ethnological record. Now, if much of this was the legacy of Romanticism, there was also a realist response. In the documentary humanist films produced by John Grierson in the 1930s, lay a celebratory vision that sought not to criticize, but to understand and communicate the drama of modernity. His was a vision reliant upon continuity and connection, not on schism and dichotomy or dualism. And in the film The Face of Scotland, 1938, the narrator remarks, quote, "But these people," he's talking about people in Glasgow, "crowded together in the smoke and sound of the drumming factory, were of the same stock as the crofters. Behind every Glasgow family, they say, you will find a croft, a farm, or a fishing village. The Scottish industrial workers still had the best qualities of the peasants, the same hardihood, the same ability. They were inventors, they made new things. In engineering shop and shipyard, they bred great craftsmen." So here the social transformation of Scottish society appears not to have restricted outlets for commonly built resourcefulness. And as Butt says, the effect of dissolving rather than cutting in the film between images of the croft ruins and the men in the pub is to assert that continuity between the two sets of images. You have repetition of the ruined Black House image, juxtaposed, sometimes simultaneously in the shot, with images of contemporary urban sociability, the pub, work scenes in the factory, and so on, to accentuate the pastness of a lost way of life, but to unfold the memory of that within the sensibility of the present. These 4 images here, stills from the face of Scotland. So the man gathering peats there, the crofts and land juxtaposed with liner going under a bridge and a football crowd. So from the mid-18th century to the mid-20th, images characteristically fit one of 2 opposing literary rhetorics. On the one hand, bitter critiques of contemporary decay set against vanishing traditions and the supposed wilderness of the natural landscapes. On the other, optimistic propaganda, which despite the imperfect present, drew upon continuities with a laudable national past. We might regard this as a contest between romance and realism, the one embodied in landscape painting or postcard photography, producing that dichotomous view of Scotland as a landscape defined in opposition and represented by sublime Highland scenery contrasted with urban industrial horrors of slum tenement. The other characteristic of photojournalism is documentary, explaining transformation more sympathetically as nurturing past virtues in the name of progress. Meanwhile, the experience of industrial depression during the 1990s produced a Gothic twist. In English Journey, J.B. Priestley remarked that between Bolton and Manchester, the ugliness is so complete that it is almost exhilarating. It's darkly romantic. W.H. Auden at the same time celebrated something of a negative epiphany in the lines, tram lines and slag heaps, pieces of machinery, that was and still is my ideal scenery. Well, in 1935, Edwin Muir produced a companion volume to Priestley's entitled Scottish Journey. And while the Highlands produced, as you'd expect, stock enchantment, in the grotesque industrial towns, as he called them, the heart of Scotland, the visual impression of a place was emblematic of the spectre of industrialism. Remember, this in photographs, this is text. But here is what Eddie Muir wrote about industrial, essentially. Iron-coloured brooks sluggishly used, three gutter percher bushes rose from sward that looked as if it had been dishonoured by some recondite infamy. Defaced and suffering patches of country, as if in this region nature no longer breathed. The forlorn villages looked like dismembered parts of towns brutally hacked off. The towns themselves, on the other hand, were like villages on a nightmare scale, which after endless building had never managed to produce what looked like a street and had no centre of any kind. Merely a great number of houses jumbled together in a wilderness of grime, coal dust and brick under a blackish trace of villages. These black slag peaks and valleys make up a toy landscape, dwarf-like and sinister, suggesting an immeasurably shriveled and debased second childhood. This scene really seemed to be more like an allegorical landscape with abstract figures than a real landscape with human beings. The abstruse ugliness of this black iron and coal region is such a true reflection of the actual processes which have gone on during the last 100 years. But the landscape has acquired a real form and symbolical significance, which one cannot find in the slatternly chaos of Glasgow. Well, there are reasons why Eddie Muir writes as he does, and he had his own particular psychological issues, having been traumatised by a move from Orkney to Glasgow as a youth. But that's another story. But the point is here, he talks about it as being a sort of almighty, anarchic, horrible mess, villages on a nightmare scale, no centre of any kind. Yet what is of interest here is that there are no visual images, only these written vignettes. The 1930s Batsford guides, designed as travelogues for middle-class motorists, were replete with dozens of images of castles, lochs, bens, and glens. And some of you may have seen these images back to the face of Scotland. Similarly, H.B. Morton's best-selling In Search of Scotland and the volume The Heart of Scotland, no exception to this. But if you look at the volume The Heart of Scotland by George Blake, which is very much part of this series, you find something slightly different. He challenged the face of Scotland that was consumed by visitors, the face, the presentation, the visual representation, if you like. And he attempted to consider how people lived and experienced what he called a consciousness of Scottishness. And he shed light on the omission of this non-iconic, greyly banal, these casualties, if you like, of modern industrialism. The topographical tourists, the motorists and the rest, he argues, miss, quote, much of the quiddity of Scotland, since an excessive emphasis on romanticism distorts the picture, he says. But so too, to Blake's mind, does the excessively realist journalism of slums and sectarianism. So as he heads out of Glasgow, the book's final paragraphs have this to say, last page. The lorries thunder through mile upon mile of farmland, indeed, but it is obviously related to an urban economy. Dereliction is the word. The stigmata of neglect litter this highway, what's now the A80, almost all the way from Glasgow to Stirling. Let the intelligent traveller consider as he passes through them the nature and provenance of Milliston, Mollinsburn, Umbernauld, and Denilone Head. These places do not present a particularly edifying picture, hence no illustrations in a book which had carried photographs. However, Blake concludes that if Scotland is to be understood rather than merely seen, one may reasonably suggest that its heart is where most of its people live. The scenery will always be there, vestigial and indestructible. It is still a fact, nevertheless, he says, that the present state of Denilone Head is of much more importance to the living community of Scotland than the bloom of heather, a vegetable of barren places on Loch Nagar. His commentary bears an uncanny resemblance to the words of a fictional character in James Robertson's And the Land Lay Still, published in 2010, who in 1985 catches a train from Glasgow to Edinburgh. Quote, the slow train, the one that went through wastelands of deindustrialised Scotland, a tour of devastation calling at Uddingston, Bellshill, Cleland, Shotts, Baldhouse, Breich, West Calder, and all those places nobody outside Scotland thinks of as being Scottish. The Scotland's so real, it defies the imagination. The same might apply to dozens of former pit villages, steel towns, and manufacturing plants, as well as many a post-war housing scheme, or even the less researched suburban middle-class estate. In the forgetting of these non-places, neither urban horror nor rural idyll, lies a real danger in misunderstanding nationhood. Indeed, Blake was correct to remind us that much of our national distinctiveness inheres not in distinctive icons or classic urban, rural, industrial, agrarian divides, but in the social landscape of unremarkable, non-photogenic non-places, the back regions where most Scots lived or have lived over the past 2 centuries. In 2002, Marion Short christened the interfacial zone between urban and rural the edgelands. There, she says, stands a landscape, often vast in area though hardly noticed, characterised by rubbish tips and warehouses, superstores and derelict industrial plant, office parks and gypsy encampments, golf courses, allotments, and fragmented, frequently scruffy farmland. Similarly, Farley and Simmons Roberts title their book Edgelands, subtitle it, sorry, Journeys into England's True Wilderness. Well, the Edgelands become the true wilderness, if you will, because their poetic overview of the dross of urbanisation, landfill sites, sewage farms, canals, ruins, wastelands, retail parks, and so on, reveals only an untranslated landscape, an imaginative space that can only be understood if, as they suggest, we break out of the duality of rural and urban landscape writing. These landscapes, they claim, differ from the interwar wasteland because they are a news landscape which makes no sense one with no obvious artistic or literary analogue. The flavour is not one of residential space, yet there are similarities both to Blake's dystopian Denny-Lone Head and indeed to the later post-industrial urbanised spaces in decline, much photographed by, for example, Oscar Mazzaroli, who was Scotland's most prolific photo documentarist, deliberately sought children as subjects to stress the vibrancy of collective life in otherwise derelict environments, so many an image like this one. The difference is that if the city schemes have now lost the sociability of the urban village, displaced by planning blight and drug-fueled disaffection of train spotting, described rather quixotically by Chris Harvey as chemical generation kale yard, the city and its liminal periphery still finds a place in our imagination. More generally, the edgelands may be complicated, unexamined places that thrive on disregards, but simply by naming them, Shord and others have furthered the quest for a new aesthetic of non-place, by definition grounded in opposition to place. The binaries, therefore, of modernity have not receded. We simply have non-place versus place. Thus, when they write, or rather wrote nearly a decade ago now, that England's edgelands are the next big thing in photography, they acknowledge the incorporation of fresh icons within the remit of place, according to modernity. If you like, they're beginning to render this untranslated landscape comprehensible, according to the same dualist lexicon that objected it. It's entered the realm of the aesthetic. For all this, though, there remain undefined spaces. Mark Auge, I think I pronounced him correctly, Auge, uses the term non-place to distinguish ephemeral, transient spaces of circulation, consumption, and communication. Now, he's talking here about airport transport lounges, motorway service stations, and so on. And he distinguishes those apart from what he calls anthropological place, any place in which inscriptions of the social bond or collective history, for example, places of worship, can be seen. Anthropological place conforms to an idea of space in which culture and identity are secure, localized, bounded by local rituals, asserting who belongs and who does not. Now, such characteristics were clearly evident in pre-modern Scotland, and are also made evident, for example, in the reports of every parish in the old statistical account of the 1790s. But the urban historian Bob Harris argues that by 1800, such a notion of space was being challenged by what he calls a modern concept of space based upon law, the market, and the utilities of production and consumption by order and improvement. The dynamics of the Scottish urban system in the Victorian period created a variety of new spaces that were very different from the historical, traditional, and imaginative spaces of, let's say, the Royal Borough or the Highland clans. Hence the social investigations of religious reformers, journalists, and indeed proto-photographers. And he talks, for example, about the railway station having no history, becoming the first urban non-space, not an anthropological space in the traditional sense. It was also a feature of modernity and the industrial system that constant demands were made for visible signs of what used to be, that the past was continually being brought into the present. For example, civic and elite buildings adopted the Scots baronial architectural styles, reminders that this was Scotland, that there was a continuity, while those who liked a villa or a country house could still live in a tenement where armorial panels contain the name of the developer and date. This, for example, one in Leith, improvement scheme. So working people's housing, nevertheless with a symbolic sort of suggestion there in the armorial plate. The battle to assert identity against anonymity became evident in the growing importance of spaces of memory, memorials, statues, and so on, and not least there the Scott Monument, for example. For Baudelaire, modernity consisted of the will coexistence of two different worlds, and we discern the essence of modernity in the presence of the past in the present that supersedes it, but still lays claim to it. Yet there are still dislocations here. All is not continuity. As Pierre Nora observes, there are lieux de mémoire, sites of memory, because there are no longer milieux de mémoire, real environments of memory. In the 20th century, photographs have become central to the burgeoning People's Museum movement. And look at any website, particularly good if you look at the islands, for example, the Communietra, if I pronounce that correctly, the People's Local History Society, absolutely burgeoning with photographs, central to that consciousness of remembered community, which is used to repopulate imaginatively in the city also, streets that have long been bulldozed. But memory, in attaching itself to sites rather than events, has become a matter of explicit signs, not of implicit meanings. And in this sense, it's more of a matter of associations, of illusions, of symbols, emblems. Increasingly, earlier places aren't integrated, but they're listed, classified, promoted to the status of places of memory. What is old is turned into spectacle. Hence, for example, the proliferation of brown traffic signs pointing us to heritage sites, as well as cafes and the rest. And paradoxically enough, it's among the amorphous edgelands that these signs are placed, inviting us to visit these national parks and ancient monuments. But significantly too, we have milieux that have never become sites of memory. Image-wise, little has altered for poor Denilone Head. Its Wikipedia entry, when I last read it, is sufficient. And it says, a village located in the Falkirk Council area. The main features include the Crown Hotel and Caserta's Chip Shop. Now, recently, Optimized Environments Limited, a multidisciplinary design company specializing, they say, in master planning and landscape appraisal, that's about reshaping the town. And there's some of their drawing board images of the western edge of Denilone Head. In seeing the nation through its signs and symbols, we often miss the narratives. As Benjamin said, history decays into images, not into stories. At local level, recapturing identity means rediscovering the past, no longer visible in the mundane present. The website Undiscovered Scotland notes that the road pattern means that Shotts, about Shotts rather than Denilone Head now, is bypassed by all major through routes. As a result, it is now somewhere visitors find themselves in without making a conscious decision to come here. But if you have the time, Shotts does repay exploration. It is not somewhere that even its greatest fan is ever likely to call pretty, but it is somewhere with a great depth of industrial heritage, as indeed the local landscape bings testify. Yet such claims aren't always easy. The Glenrothes Town Centre Action Plan notes as follows. Glenrothes was constructed in 1948 under the New Town Scotland Act. It grew and is now home to approximately 40,000 people. In 2009, Glenrothes Town Centre won, if that's the right word, Prospect Magazine's Carbuncle Award for the most dismal place in Scotland. In reality, quotation continues, the town centre. There is only limited out-of-hours activity and nothing that could reasonably be described as an evening economy. The outdoor spaces are grim and cheerless, and leisure facilities such as bowling and nightclubs have failed. The lack of usable quality public space means there is no natural venue for outdoor events, farmers' markets, or community celebrations. The architecture of the town centre is uninspiring. Only St Columba's Church in the 1950s shopping precinct at the east end of the town. Only St Columba's Church in the 1950s shopping precinct at the east end of the town make a positive contribution to the townscape. There we have Glenrothes. So wilderness might suggest the middle of nowhere, but the real suburban nowhere has no middle. Get your head around that. Against this long slide into globalized blandness and civic deculturation, architects seek to simulate mythical historical frameworks. The guide to the Scottish Housing Expo 2010 in Inverness notes, quote, The streets and housing layout are inspired by the sociable qualities of settlements in the Highlands, such as cropping communities, with their nearby common grazing areas, where farming work was shared in wintertime. Or Hirta, St Kilda, where an island parliament was held outdoors on the street. However, the result is scarcely distinctive. At a time when nationhood is conveyed through its symbols and representations, ignoring those places whose ordinariness positions them outside the dichotomous iconography of modernity versus anti-modernity, has effectively erased from historical consciousness the milieu and the meaning of such places. We've forgotten, arguably, the suburban housing schemes, the semi-agricultural lowlands, the nondescript zones of manufacturing that were and are, in fact, the great swathes of the country where most people live. Every nation has its icons, but few are so starkly out of line with the lived reality. In Scotland throughout the 20th century, between 3 and 4/5 of people have resided in the industrial lowlands, and only a minority of these inhabited the inner city areas. The real opacity of vision then lies in thinking that because symbolic pictorial qualities are absent, these zones might somehow lack significant social meaning. So when the social historian asks, where are the studies of post-war suburban Scotland? Why are the images lacking? The answer must be they don't exist because no one has thought to consider such places distinctive of Scottish identity. They're amorphous because we have no clear picture of them. And we have no clear picture because they don't fit the binary conventions of post-romantic visual appreciation. Now, this isn't quite true, of course. For example, the promotional documentaries made by Films of Scotland between the mid-50s and the 1980s, 200 of them, provide a wealth of fascinating imagery. There, for example, Mr. Fraser admires the new Kincardine power station. And not just the imagery of industrialism evident in that still, for example, but the style of the cars, the clothing, the level of pollution and all the rest. A lot of these images would well repay detailed study. Similarly, the Archives of Historical Environment Scotland, formerly RCA HMS, this, for example, a walkway in Cumbernauld, so the hypermodern style of Le Corbusier and others used in Cumbernauld, evident if you look in that archive, or the multifarious image collections available via Scran. Here's Glenn Rothes again from a photograph in The Scotsman. So in the past, there have been great insights into industrial ruins too, also by Edensaw and others. And I think these could be also brought to bear to our analysis of this particular archive, to understanding pre-industrial environments. So that is all I have to say today. You can read more about this if you care to email me, for example. I can give you a couple of references to things I wrote a couple of years ago now. But really, the research is there to be done. I'm simply suggesting that there's a lot to be done on imagistic research in 20th century Scotland, and it's not all about the inner city or indeed the Celtic periphery, but about those edgelands, which are in fact central to our social history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. There's so much to think about. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. May I ask if anybody would like to ask Andrew some questions?
Can you hear me? I was curious about the email address. I'd love to email Andrew. And I was just wondering, I'm assuming it's probably just on the university website, is that right?
A.Blaikie. You got that A.Blaikie, and then it's the Aberdeen website. You're correct, at abdn.ac.uk.
Thank you.
Good.
Andrew, this is Crocher O'Gilligan here from the UHI. Thanks a million for that very interesting and engaging talk. Could I ask a question about related to your talk about the movement of population in the process of modernization and industrialization? Isn't there a general tendency anyhow that the moved population in occupying an urban space, that'll generate to an extent a neo-pastoralism because of nostalgia for the area they have left?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're particularly talking about urban Highlanders now. And or indeed in the 20th century, a number of migrant and immigrant communities. Undoubtedly, I mean, I think if you're talking about on-the-ground society and things like shop signs, street signs and such, there is evidence of that. So even if you were just to visit the centre of any city, you'd find, I mean, interestingly, in the middle of Aberdeen, we have Patagonia Lane next to Gallic Lane and the Gallic Church. That tells you, could tell you a lot of stories. You have the Italian ice cream shops, grocer shops, the signs, foreign surnames and so on. So there's a lot that's indicative of those communities, whether it's nostalgic or otherwise, and the closure to some extent. But what is interesting is this absence of much in the way of visual imagery. I mean, let's say you were to go to the Glenrothes. Where would you find evidence of migrant enclaves in Glenrothes from anything that's visible that has been photographed? That's the kind of argument I think one would need to pursue. Don't think that's particularly helpful, but that's all I can really think of.
Hello, Andrew. Thank you very much for your presentation. My name's Kate McCullough, and I'm from Heriot Watt and the UHI. And I was really, I suppose, taken. I'm an ethnologist, anthropologist, ethnologist. I was really taken with your conversation with the theme of memory, and I suppose thinking about my own research and practice, the difficulty in creating the record that has been of interest and of concern to ethnologists as well. The documenting of communities through images as a critical practice is, I suppose, the question I have, I'm just kind of formulating this as I think, is around our a priori valuation of the ideas of remembering and forgetting, and who gets to remember and who gets to forget. And I'm thinking particularly of the value of forgetting and the ability and the choice to forget, as I think Paul de Ricoeur calls it, the happy forgetting, the ability to say that there are things that should not be part of the archive, should not become part of the archive, or we question why they are. And there's been some great work recently by Ariella Azoulay in terms of exploring the archive as an opportunity for the unlearning of imperialism, which I hear implicitly a lot in your presentation. But I just wonder if you could say a bit to critical practices as we go back through this imagic archive in terms of exploring also the decision to forget, or the choice to forget.
That's inevitably difficult for anyone conducting historical practice, because clearly the decision to forget means that something is not going to be recorded. So we're talking about investigating the absences. I guess we start from its opposite. If one thinks of the photograph, for example, the photograph snapshot, for example, has always been about remembering happy occasions, weddings, birthdays, parties, holidays. And those occasions which are atypical but nevertheless particularly happy. By contrast, those events which are particularly unhappy are not the events which are going to be photographed, unless they are more collective than individualistic. If you have, for example, something, a photograph of a disaster, mine disaster, or something like that. So the nature of individual memory and individual forgetting makes it doubly difficult for us to capture it, because it's first of all, it's recorded privately anyway, and secondly, because it's something that the individual does not wish to record. I mean, how would you go about this? I mean, is there literature which suggests there are ways to capture those absences?
Well, I guess the starting point, as you suggested, is the presence of absence. You know, to be aware of the lacuna. And in my work, in my practice particularly, which is a practice-based research, I'm working with people who are living and dead. You know, I work with the archive as well as the archive of the living and the dead. And in as much as I would apply an ethnographical process with people who are participating in my research, you know, being alongside people as people in their lived experience, where it's possible to do that in the archive, which includes, you know, of course, a whole kind of mosaic of research and looking for what's not the punctum, what's not represented, what's not catching your eye, but is out of sight in the image and yet implied. So critical practice, I think, is really important in that. And perhaps that's a meeting place for disciplines, you know, perhaps that's a work for ethnologists and historians together, because we're often using the same materials and dialectics, but the appearance of different approaches and you know, difference in the disciplines is useful. But I suppose also there's a question here of ownership, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that testimony can be, if you're doing, for example, oral historical research, and we're talking about forgetting, and people may be wishing to forget something like a particularly bad childhood or something of that nature, then they would be able to, the researcher might be able to investigate that by asking people to sort of speak to them and give testimony and tell how it was, though it was not recorded and they wish to forget it. You can't do that with the visual very easily. Similarly, with a lot of investigation, however, if you look at people who are investigating, say, the Victorian city or slum dwellings at any point in the last 200 years, because people were interested in reform, they were doing research of what many people would wish to forget, what was bad, if you like, and bringing that into the foreground. So there's an awful lot of research there's an awful lot of imagery, on slum housing from Annan forwards to today, because these were bad conditions that weren't, you know, that didn't show the society in a good light, that weren't used in any kind of patriotic or touristic sense, but nevertheless were recorded. So it may be useful to look at why things that people wish to forget were not recorded. The problem is, if people wish to forget them, they're not likely to voice them. So we have to engage a kind of historical insight there initially to decide what we wish to look at. So, for example, when I'm talking about the forgotten places and places that nobody researched, or for example, Ben Rothers, which is only kind of memorable because it's a new town, or better still, Cumbernauld. Actually, if you look at Cumbernauld, there's an awful lot of material from when it was first designed and built, showing up the virtues of its architecture and the society. There's a lot of social engineering going on that people tried to create there. And interestingly, going back to the previous question about migrant communities, of course, people in the new towns came largely from the inner city poor housing and relocated. So what element of nostalgia might be visible in among those relocated communities that they had not necessarily, well, in that case, they were wanting to remember, but in other cases, maybe not. Yes.
Hello. I have a question. I don't have a camera. I'm Jack McGregor. I'm with Emeritus, UHI, and I was just wanting to. First of all, love the presentation. It was so exciting. I wanted to ask about this non-photogenic, a non-place that you talk about. I think that's really interesting, especially when you think about late 20th century and 21st century new builds and that kind of area where, as you say, most of Scotland lives, and yet is not as represented as we are in, as you mentioned, with the Celtic periphery. And I wanted to ask about basically the future, and how do you think we will we look back at all on these spaces? And I often think about the fact that the slum housing conditions that were talked about earlier in your talk, in many ways, there's a different kind of poverty in these areas that not only comes from that lack of community, but also from the fact that a lot of these areas are filled with people that are, everything is on finance versus their possessions, their home, their car, their devices. It's another form of being tied to where you are, this lack of ability to go and pick up and move around and have this freedom that we grant to people in the middle and upper classes in this country. And I wanted to sort of think about, like, looking to the future, how do you think we'll remember these places? I suppose it's difficult, it's a bit of a hypothetical, but how do you think we'll look back on these spaces?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, architects used to talk about the 70-year rule. What that was that jerry-built housing, back-to-backs, Coronation Street, that kind of slum as was often thought of as ugly and unmemorable and passed by. But give it 2 or 3 generations and it becomes something that's precious, that becomes distinctive, that becomes something that's heavily photogenic. And you find that with these new builds, for example. I would imagine that if the human race is still here in 50 or 60 years' time, we will look on these in the same way that we look on back-to-back terraced housing, as somehow distinctive in a way that we simply cannot see at the present. So that's one aspect. But the other aspect, of course, about how people live is an entirely different matter, because seeing the architecture of a place doesn't tell you anything about the actual society of the people in that place. So you would need an imagery of people interacting, for example. But also, when you're talking about things like finance, it's very difficult to capture that very obviously nowadays. In photography, you can capture poverty in the past quite evidently from people's clothing, for example, from the state of the interiors of their houses. Arguably, that's rather more difficult to do nowadays.
Yeah, I would say it's more nefarious now.
Yeah, the signifiers are much more many and varied. But history has this habit of sort of clarifying some things and not others, and stereotyping some things and not others. So we lose in that stereotyping, we lose the particularity of many environments, and we place upon the stereotypical environment a series of meanings that are supposedly there in the aggregate, but we're not necessarily there when you get down to the particular level. Does that help?
I wonder if I could ask a question.
Hello, Matt.
Hi, Andrew. How are you doing? It's Matt Sillers from Inverness. I was wondering whether the photographic cultural account of the edgelands might be in the accidental photographs of the people who live there, the family snaps, in the accidental backgrounds to family day outs or the kids sitting in the front garden or the backyard. Would the evidence of edgelands be in those accidental family snaps, do you think?
I think so, massively so, I think. What you put me in mind of there is one of the Films of Scotland films, which focuses on Glenrothes, and it looks at a family, you know, the guys tilling the garden, the kids playing with sort of toy cars and stuff, and you get a sense of the space in which people operate, you know, and whether or not there are cars on the street. Far fewer, obviously, in the 50s and 60s, this kind of thing, and it is accidental.
Yeah, and these images aren't privileged by archives terribly much because they're not of the memorialised places, they're not of the local church, they're not of the local hillside, they're not of the football park. So therefore, they're still missing, I think, in the cultural account, but there's a wealth of knowledge and information there.
Yeah, I mean, a lot to be gained from moving film as well, because, you know, the photograph, obviously, there's a staged element, it's cropped, it's framed, and so on. With moving film, you're traveling across many of these things and you get a lot of background and you can focus on elements of that background. And I think, you know, in a sense, the edgelands were background to everything. So it's a background of a background, if you like. And it's extraordinary how one grasps for meaning. You know, you see a photograph of a council estate in the 1950s, and because there hasn't been much research done on this, you start to grasp for meanings in all sorts of corners of the picture and learn to read these images in particular ways. And there's a lot out there. Just go on, I mean, just as an initial foray, if you were to go on Scran and put in certain keywords, there's an awful lot of material. And I think, you know, the idea of a photographic archive used to be something that you would go and visit in a particular library or museum. But nowadays, so much of that is online that it's very accessible, at least initially.
Scran is an amazing resource for visual culture, essentially. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Hello, Andrew. Mind if I...
Hello.
My name is Julian Grant, and your discussion of visual discourses of Scottish life is really interesting to me, as I'm working on a community photography project exploring local residents' perceptions of tourism around the North Coast 500. So a lot of resonances there around representations of the place and things. As I think about this dichotomy you describe and the erasure of edgelands that it implies, it strikes me that in the past, the technologies and the sort of avenues for creating and disseminating these visual discourses were inaccessible to most people. But in a contemporary sense, the ubiquity of smartphones and the internet creates a whole new array of sort of ways of projecting visual information. And in my experience, a lot of my exposure to the edgelands comes from Snapchat and Twitter and Instagram stories, which document spaces that wouldn't previously have sort of had images broadcast of them. And sure, those might tend to be scenes of intoxication and antics, but it strikes me that the new kind of digital format might be a really valuable resource for reinterpreting the edgelands and how they're represented. So just wondering how that strikes you as a space for further research.
Absolutely fascinating. I mean, I think to an extent you can accuse me of being something of a coward by retreating into history. And retreating in all sorts of other ways, like not including television as a resource, for example. Films, you know, documentary film takes you so far, but you could go into all sorts of fiction and television. And basically, we've become a much more visually literate culture over the past 50, 60 years. And it would be a sin not to use the fruits of that particular technology, particularly nowadays. You know, in a project like your own, you have amazing access to resources. I guess the problem about using something, you know, like Snapchat and Instagram and everything is it's almost boundless. You know, it's just this growing cloud of possible information, rather than walking into an archive and seeing you've got 10 boxes you can look at. I think that is part of the, I mean, it's both a benefit and a disadvantage at the same time. So I would see it as an amazing resource, but one that, you know, it would be very difficult to develop any kind of representative image, let's say, of that experience of the tourists of the North Coast 500, because there are simply so many possible takes that are actually being physically taken on camera phones. But you know, I wish you luck. It sounds fantastic.
I'm going to jump in here and thank Andrew enormously. You have given us so much to think about the visual turn, the backgrounds of backgrounds, these non-places. We've got a lot to dig into, and I'm sure everybody here is very, very grateful. Yeah, we look forward to seeing you again at our UHI conference when it arrives, the Hark and Silk one. And thank you again for today.
Well, thank you all very much and for your contribution.